So point of order, I do have strep throat, so that gets you back for everything you just said. Secondly, I wanted to say that I was supposed to go on yesterday, and it sounded like Darcy and Felix both had suggested they switch their slots from today, so I didn't have to speak yesterday, which was awesome for me. Now, if you haven't given any talks before, you may not realize how big of a thing that was for them, because 85% of talks are written about an hour before you go on stage. So for them to say and volunteer to go up a day before is awesome. I thank you both and the organizers for not murdering me for suggesting I maybe not go yesterday. Also, my mom is here. She's amazing because even after all these years, she's still trying to figure out what GitHub actually is. So hopefully this talk will shed some light on that, maybe. Okay, I want to talk about building a startup. These are the rules, the recipe to success to build a startup into a company and be very famous and awesome. Number one, hire trendy rock stars. You're at a Ruby conference, so you're already well into step number one. Then be super transparent. That means writing a lot of interesting blog posts about how you built your cool company. Speak at a lot of conferences. Be well known for your company and being awesome. Number five, roll around in money. You hire lots and lots of people. And then you never ever speak to these community members again. You ignore the community. You WhatsApp all over the place. And then you start another company. This is really stupid. I don't like this. I don't know why this is now a thing. But I see this happen a couple of different times now. Especially, this happened in Ruby too, where some companies got really big and talked a lot about this sort of stuff at conferences 5 or 6 years ago, and you don't hear that much from them anymore. So, it's kind of interesting when you think about it. There's like millions of talks about one-person companies, because that's easy. I could create a company right now and say, here's the story I had creating this company 20 seconds ago. But there's only not as many talks about 10-person companies, hundreds of talks about 100-person companies, not many talks about growing a company from 0 to 1,000. Because at that point, you're too busy, you're a CEO or something, and you just can't talk about this stuff. My goal is that GitHub is not that type of company anymore. I want GitHub to remain open and still keep talking about the weird challenges and stuff that we face, because I think some of the stuff, as we grow and become a bigger company, is the really, really interesting parts that you don't get from reading some dude's blog post on Blogspot or something like that. And that's why I wanted to give this talk. I want to talk about these interesting aspects. So I am Zach Holman, Holman on GitHub, Holman on Twitter. I've been at GitHub for almost 4 years. It'll be my 4-year anniversary in about a week or two, which is strange. That's, I don't know, a lot longer than I'd ever thought I'd live at a company. And I've sort of talked about GitHub and how we work and stuff like this for 3-ish years at this point. You may know me from such slideshows as how GitHub uses GitHub to build GitHub, scaling GitHub, how GitHub works, how to build a GitHub, a bunch of different aspects of GitHub. Not necessarily because I really care about Git repositories, because I think Git is kind of silly sometimes. But I would still give these sorts of talks even if we shipped bananas or sold cars or something, because I really love to talk about developers and building companies and making people happy and stuff. I think that's really interesting. But looking back, all of this stuff sort of stemmed from when GitHub was maybe 30 to 75 employees. And I gave talks past then, but that's sort of when the ideas and all the foundations of what I talked about stemmed from. That's slightly different. We're 240 now. 240 is a lot more people. And that has a lot of implications to go with it. Has anybody ever heard about DUNBAR'S number here? DUNBAR'S number is that famous number. If you haven't heard, you don't know the definition. It's an imaginary employee number that Hacker News fetishizes will kill your company. This came up every single time I ever talked about GitHub. It'd be like, oh, that's adorable, but once you become 25 employees, it's all going to change. Once you become 50 employees, it's all going to change. 100, 150, 200, 1,000. So therefore, I don't have to listen to what you're saying, et cetera, et cetera. DUNBAR'S number is actually, it's basically a guy who studied interpersonal relationships in large organizations. And it's basically a maximum limit of relationships a human can meaningfully maintain. So at that point, there's some limit to where you can keep all these relationships in your head. And the implication is that once you reach that limit, you can no longer rely upon yourself or your buddies to grow your company effectively, you have to start relying upon structure and communication, and that stuff becomes really important to grow the company. This is probably about 150-ish, anywhere from like 125 to 250 or something like that. But there's some sort of limit, and 150 is a good number where you can realize that like once you get to that point, it changes things. I don't know how many people are in really large companies here or a lot of startups, but I never thought I'd be at a company bigger than 40. So 150 is staggeringly large to me. I say that to some people and they just laugh at me and they go back to their 60,000 person company. But this is a big deal for me. Looking back, everything that I've talked about publicly can sort of be fit into this idea of how GitHub worked. And if you look at how we work today, that's another subset of things. And if you line up the Venn diagram, it probably looks something like this. We're not going to suddenly be like, oh, we're changing everything. This is all ridiculous. Why did we ever say this? It's not that much different. But for me, I think the parts that did change are really fascinating. Like this small incremental change is what makes up everything. I really think that progress happens along the edges. And if you can start identifying those edges earlier on in your company as your company starts growing into the same sort of pain points that we may have faced, I think that sort of gets you a step up on progressing into the next level of companydom. I don't know what that means, but this stuff's really interesting to me. And that's what this talk is about. So the 2-minute recap. If you've been totally ignoring everything, my life's purpose for the last 2 years, I'm going to recap this in 2 minutes because I can be summed up in 2 minutes entirely, apparently. Number one, GitHub is 60% remote. This is probably the number one thing for GitHub. And this is true today. We're still 60% remote, people who don't live in San Francisco. This sort of informs everything that we end up doing. This goes along the lines of like we don't have stand-up meetings, we don't have face-to-faces very much because a lot of the times people aren't in the same office as you. We try to build tools around the idea that we're not in the same time zone as you either. And this sort of informs how we work along the line. GitHub is asynchronous is the other thing, along the lines of time zones. If you work in 12-hour shifts for me, I want our communications to be asynchronous, meaning that I can just send you something, forget about it, work on something else, and trust that you'll get back to me later. It's not synchronous. I'm not waiting on you. You're not blocking me from doing the work that I'm doing now. GitHub has no managers. I'll probably put an asterisk next to this. We're basically no managers. We still have no technical managers who are like assigning bugs, doing this classically managerial stuff. I had those at my first job, and I absolutely hated them. My apologies to anybody who's a manager in here, but there's a famous Venn diagram that Ryan Tomeko put in one of his talks where he says, problems that GitHub has, problems that managers are good for, and like the overlap between the two are so small. And I think that's still true today, but that's still true today, I guess. So I'm going to talk about a bunch of different aspects. I'm going to actual slides that I said publicly, and I'm going to make myself a fool and then start talking about how things have changed since the time I actually said those things. The first thing I want to talk about is deployment. Because I think deployment is, it's the constant. No matter how big you end up getting, you still have to deploy code to production, whether that is ship software, like natively, or web software, if you're lucky like us. I had a slide that looked like this. Limit your deployments, where you can deploy your code to just your staff, you can deploy it just to your beta users, to one particular server in your cluster of servers, or to one particular app process on one particular server. The idea was that we wanted to limit the amount of impact that your code has on general population, to make sure that you don't actually break things. That's awesome. I don't disagree with that. But in hindsight, I think our deployments got a lot simpler. For one, we rarely deploy to individual servers or subsets anymore. And I'm mostly speaking from the perspective of an app developer. I don't have to deal with a lot of like the low-level networking stuff. But we have a much simpler deployment process, because I think it's easy to say, oh, we should probably set up all these controls and like deploy only to little certain things, and it ends up not being that meaningful. So my targets are basically deploy to production, YOLO, or you can deploy to a staff server in production, just to make sure that only people who have access only GitHub employees can work on that code for a little bit, make sure it's not going to break anything, and then go on from there. The reason why I say this is I think that staging environments are the first to decay. By that, I mean that if our ops team is facing two problems between, well, staging is down and, well, production is down, they're more often than not going to just say, well, staging can wait, and it's going to stay broken for a little bit more. We do have staging environment. It's, again, mostly for low-level networking, like if you're changing things with the Git protocol or changing with stuff on disk. That's the stuff you want to try rolling out in staging first, but if you're a typical Rails developer, just don't bother with staging. Push it out to production right away. It's simpler. You have, you're isolated, so only staff members can see that, but you have access to all your production data. You have access to production hooks, all of this sort of stuff there for you. Fewer deployment targets lead to simpler deploy lines, so you're not all waiting on some staging environment to stay open. Everything is done through our chat robot, Hubot, so we can ask it, where do I want to deploy? And it'll say, oh, production's unlocked. Staff 1 and Staff 4 are locked by Otto and Muan. Here are the branches that are deployed right now. This is a nice, easy way to say, okay, where can I actually deploy my code and see it in production right now? We have about 5 or so staff environments now, including production. But the new thing that happened in the last month or so, we can also spin up dynamic branch servers effectively. Or at least, not servers, but environments. So I can say, I want to deploy GitHub/mybranch to production, and it will spin up in a staff environment just for me on my branch. I can let that sit for a while, make sure it's not going to break, and then merge it into master, and then tear down that environment later. With so many people working on the GitHub environment at this point, it's very easy to end up with lock contention and trying to figure out, well, I want to get my code out right now. I don't want to wait on you. I don't want to queue up in some dumb line. It's kind of a nice way to do that sort of stuff. I've talked a lot about feature flags already, and this is a slide I had from a while ago where I said, staff-only feature flags are great. Limits your exposure, keeps you real-world conditions, and avoids a bunch of hairy merge conflicts when you're ready to deploy to production. This meaning that, again, only staff can see the code that you deploy, but it's on your production servers. That's great. Again, awesome. In hindsight, deployments got way more staff shipped. I'm to the point where I don't really deploy any line of code without deploying it to a staff ship server for a period of a minute to a day or something like that. Like most of our features now are staff ships for weeks or months at a time. And it's okay to pull things out sometimes. We've had some staff ship features that were shipped and built and awesome for 8, 10, 12 months, and then we started to realize that this is not a good feature, this is terrible. We ripped it apart, pulled it out, and then just didn't ship it ever. And that's great. But the fact that we could get it out in production, let the GitHub internal organization play with it and test it out, that's been really important for us. And it's only grown in importance more and more as we've grown as a company. We've also mostly stopped using external beta testers. Usually when we say, like, who in this room would like to see some new experimental GitHub feature ahead of everyone else? Yeah, everyone says that, then you're all assholes, and you never give us actual feedback on that. You're not like testers, you're just like leechers or something like that. And it's really hard to find somebody who is really, it takes a certain talent to be able to say, this is not what's working for me, this might be a better direction to head in. So we just tend not to do this as much anymore. We tend to, I think part of this is just that GitHub is so big now. 240 people, from everyone from designers to developers to HR to everyone across the board. And we can rely upon staff shipping rather than having external beta testers not contribute as much feedback to us. And it's also much easier to break things for staff than it is for somebody external to the company, even if you give them a disclaimer that this may break. The other thing that's changed probably in the last like 3 or 4 months is we do much more team shipping than staff shipping at this point. By that, I mean, take like the 2-factor authentication that we added to GitHub last year, which you should all be using if you don't already. When we were about to ship that, they first shipped it to only people on the 2FA GitHub team. So literally the people in the GitHub organization who were on the 2FA team. So those 6 or so people got to play around with it before the rest of the company actually got to see it. And that was great because, one, authentication is always a little scary. You don't want to lock people out of their accounts with some dumb bug. but two, it sort of, it focuses the feedback. I'll talk about this in a lot more length in the rest of this talk, but it becomes problematic with so many people and so many bright people. That's kind of code word for opinionated people. It's easy to be, all right, I'm focusing on this project, but this guy's doing something over here, and I disagree with what he's doing, so I'm gonna stop everything, tell him that he sucks, and then go back to my stuff, and then he's terrible and feels bad for the rest of the day. Like, we want to stop doing as much of that and let people focus on more team-related stuff. So we've been moving more from just generally shipping to everyone internal to the company to doing much more team-oriented shipping. Another big thing I want to talk about is people. As everyone says, people is everything or something. People are important, I guess. I had a slide like this. Reduce institutional knowledge. This is talking about bringing new hires on into the company. And the idea is that you put a lot more documentation into wikis, issues, chat logs, and pull requests. Not a bad idea. And then I said your new hire is stoked to dive in, start reading, start contributing, so don't get in their way. That's the part where I think that we've changed a lot. I would say get in their way a lot more. This is something that became painfully obvious as GitHub became bigger and bigger and bigger. You want to be able to let people go off on their own and learn on their own without getting in their way, but you also want to kind of point them in the right direction. I think for too long we ended up kind of going hands-off and saying, well, we only hire smart people, so therefore they can figure it out. But it's much, much harder to do that as you grow the company, and there's so many different projects going on. So keep information accessible, but indoctrinate a lot longer. We have these buddy weeks where your first week you have to come to San Francisco, and we give you a buddy, and we sort of have somebody there for you to sort of show you the ropes on everything. And then after that week is done, we're like, all right, go off and do stuff, which is intimidating. I mean, my first week was, I sat down with one of the founders, and he said, all right, run the app. And then the app didn't run for 2 weeks, and he was sort of off anyway. But like, we can't do that anymore. You need some longer indoctrination and getting people into your company. It's just harder to acclimate to larger companies. And it's not just code, it's not just figuring out code styles. It's like HR, it's trying to figure out accounting stuff. It's trying to figure out where do I go for health insurance. So we still have a buddy for your first week, but I think what we want to do is start exploring longer buddy relationships to the point of, 3 months, 6 months, not like hand-holding or anything like that, but just there's a point of contact that you can talk to and ask, well, what do I do next? I just finished this project. What is the biggest pain points to focus on next? So that's been sort of something we're coming around to. It takes a long time to sort of revamp the hiring process, but it's been a learning process. I had a slide like this. It said, trust your employees. That was wrong. Never trust your employees. I'm just kidding. This is a really good idea. This stems from the idea that a lot of people earlier on, myself definitely included, I just didn't want people to micromanage me. Like, just trust me to do the work, and like, I won't have to worry about any of that stuff like that. You want people to focus on the work. Don't, busybody them and deal with that. The subtle drawback here is that you end up reducing a ton of feedback. And like, the main thing I'm talking about here, I'm happy that a lot of other people, I've seen this in the last year or two, bring this up in their own talks, is imposter syndrome. If you don't know imposter syndrome, it's basically the idea that you don't feel welcome here. You feel like you don't fit at this particular company or this particular group because you have all these smart people and stuff around you. And that's intimidating. And it's like, it's frustrating sometimes because you're talking to somebody who's obviously brilliant. And you're like, you just did X, Y, and Z, like, why are you feeling this way? And they're like, well, I just didn't have anybody, really telling me either way, and there's all these great people around me, like, am I even doing right? Am I gonna get fired next week? Or, it's the opposite, or people really love me? They just don't know. And for us, it's even harder for remote workers because you don't get that informal, hey, how are you doing type of thing. And I think that we try to come up with better processes to handle this, particularly for remote workers. The last thing we sort of want is to have like official IM conversations like once a week, like, all right, now we're gonna talk about you. Because that's not necessarily where the best feedback comes from. At least for me, I like just going out to lunch or going to the bar or something like that and saying, well, how are you doing? What are you interested in working on in the future? That's the sort of, it's less stressful for everybody. And that's harder for remote workers. So there's a lot of things we're trying to do. We're trying to do the longer buddying process, as I was mentioning. A lot more Google Hangouts or Skype or FaceTime or whatever you're into. And then more meet space visits to GitHub headquarters in San Francisco. Usually, if you're remote, we'll have one big summit a year, and then you'll usually come up to San Francisco twice a year with your team, and then maybe once or twice beyond that as well. And again, this is just trying to get as much as being remote is awesome and great, and not having to deal with people in real life is awesome. Sometimes you have to, and it's really great to get people face-to-face contact. So that's a really good solution as well. But it's something that is definitely just tricky in a lot of organizations, just deal with imposter syndrome and going from there. I had a slide like this a while ago. GitHub was 5 years old at that point. 0 employees had quit, and we had made it to 108 employees. We made it 199, much to my everlasting chagrin. Did not make it to 200, but I'm still super proud about this number. It's not really a number that we really cared too much about, because I think on some level it's super helpful to have people leave the company. Inevitably, it's going to be, I want to build my own thing, or I found a different job I'm going to work at, or I'm going to do a whole bunch of other things. And I think that's going to be a credit to GitHub to have people go off and do other things. But the idea is that retention is super important. And I think that we try to figure out ways to help people stay happy in their jobs as much as possible. People are going to leave, but minimizing that is really important. And that's the big takeaway. Not enough people realize that, it can take 6 months to try and replace somebody in terms of trying to hire the right person, interviewing them, getting them up to speed in the code base before they feel comfortable enough to start replacing the type of work that you just lost from somebody who just left the company. So think on that a little bit. I had kind of a wildly inaccurate slide looking back now. The product company, dog food, we're still that way. We had a part in here, full ownership. We were totally bootstrapped. That was cool. Rocking the world and stuff. And then we took a small seed funding. Small Series A from Andreessen Horowitz. I could probably do a whole talk on VC, but I want to talk a little bit about money and how that has changed stuff over the years. Really the weirdest thing out of all this stuff is that funding somehow lended us legitimacy, which I think says as much for an industry as anything else. For one, suddenly big media covered us. As soon as we got the investment, we were in Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Wired, like every single publication covered us, which they had never really covered us before. TechCrunch had never written about us more than twice, I think. One of them was the launch of Gist, which is the randomest thing. As soon as we got the funding, there's now a writer who obviously tracks our RSS feed and writes about us every time now, which is really strange. It also became much easier to lease office space. We had real difficult time in San Francisco saying, all right, we're a very profitable company. We've been profitable since inception. Here are our figures and stuff. And then it'd always be like, well, what's your valuation? What's your VC? And we're like, well, we're profitable. We don't need all that stuff. And they're like, oh, I don't want to touch it. You're too much of a risk. And then like once we took VC, they're just like throwing offices at our face and stuff. It's really strange. It's more San Francisco craziness than anything. But anyway, tech industry is really crazy. I don't really have much more to say than this. I don't really understand it sometimes. Funding is this weird, zany thing that has been really interesting to see. On a personal aspect, I don't think it has changed GitHub in the slightest. I love Andreessen Horowitz. They seem cool, but I could say, fuck you, Andreessen Horowitz, and I don't really care because they don't seem to really want to massage our opinions or anything weird like that. The main insight, I think, looking back, is I think bootstrapping was the key foundation for all of this sort of stuff. The fact that we could get such a big, large round was just the idea that the founders could say no because we were profitable. And I think it's much easier to say, to ask for really good terms and to be able to own the company still and not have them looking over your shoulder every step of the way, is if you can just prove the business for many years before even going down that route, even if you don't want to go down that route at all. So that's the interesting hindsight from all of that. Also, the money's crazy. I don't know. Talk briefly about organization a little bit. I talked about teams slightly. This was like most of the teams when I was talking. We probably have like 20 or 30 teams at this point now. Those 2 redacted ones both shipped. I have no idea what they are. Probably one of them's GitHub for Windows or something like that. Looking back now, like teams became much more important. And this is something that is obviously a no-brainer. As you grow the company, teams are going to become more and more important as you have to start focusing on specific problems and trying to communicate amongst the whole company. I think the problem is that everyone has opinions. As I was saying earlier, everyone's very opinionated. And these type of drive-by opinions are less valuable. That's sort of been our realization as we've grown. And I think it was a big problem for a while, going from this idea that no one was on a team up until, I don't know, about 75 employees. It was still very much loose in terms of like everyone had involvement in a bunch of different teams so they could go on to different things. And then transitioning that into, no, we're gonna focus on teams, you're gonna have to join a team, you're gonna have to do all this sort of stuff. And it was a problem for a while because people still had these drive-by opinions where they're like, oh, I don't like the button color on that. You know, screw you. They wouldn't say screw you, but it's the same sort of thing where, you know, I'm trying to work on something with my team here and we're focusing on this, and someone across the company who's spent 3 minutes on it, which is sometimes valuable, is, you know, spitting some feedback on it that's maybe not as valuable. One of the things that we've sort of done to combat this is using GitHub's team mentions on issues and pull requests and things like that. We use it internally for our internal communications app and stuff like that. So on most issues, you'll see stuff like this, you know, cc at github/design, so I can ping all the designers at once, or ping the whole ops team. I can ping everyone who loves techno music at GitHub, like that team actually exists. And the reason why I think this is, it's a really subtle point, but I think people leave teams if they aren't active. Literally just because signal to noise. And I've noticed this a lot, where I'll get really interested in a project for a while, and I'll start committing code to this project, and then I'll move off onto some other stuff, but I'll still get notifications because I'm still on the same GitHub team from people notifying me. And I just realized, well, you know, this has a different team right now. I don't have to worry about this anymore. I'm just gonna leave the team and move on. It's a nice subtle way of not mandating, you know, hitting over your head, like, are you still on this team? Like, make a decision right now. It's kind of a, you know, it's lo-fi way of doing that, which is nice. And people can sort of self-select whether or not they want to be very involved with that team in those decisions or not. It's the same thing, same reason behind team shipping versus staff shipping as much. Because only the people who are really involved with that team will be on that team and want to see that stuff in production deployed. It also protects against negative feedback. This is just a problem in our industry, I think. I think people are way too gung-ho about, I have to get my 2 cents in right now and say how much this sucks, otherwise the world's gonna collapse. And we have a real problem with trying to corral that feedback into something positive. And it doesn't even have to be something positive, it just can be something not negative sometimes. Because it's just taxing, especially if you spend so much time on something and somebody comes in and says, oh, this PR sucks. I had a slide like this. We had a bunch of rooms at GitHub that we can discuss things. We have 185 now. There's a lot more rooms. We use chat rooms a bunch because creating chat rooms, super cheap and easy. You just create them. We use Campfire still. Campfire is a trooper. A lot along the same lines, if you have more rooms, you have higher signal to noise. And I'm gonna start drifting out of chat rooms if I'm not super interested in that team that is in that particular chat room. I only idle in 4 chat rooms right now. And I think most people are probably anywhere between 4 and 10. You sort of pick and choose your battles in terms of how much signal and noise you want to receive for that particular topic, and it sort of weeds out the people from those teams that are not as interested in it. At this slide, everyone is a manager. Still have no real managers. Still, everyone is a manager. This is still something that I kind of want to give this talk in another 6 months, because right now we're trying to figure out this idea of a leadership team, which is much more about product direction rather than trying to do a traditional management role. So this stuff is still very much in flux. But at its core, we still have teams with a perp, basically, which means a primarily responsible person. It's kind of their ass on the line for the product to ship. You know, it's mostly just to have someone to point to make sure that, like, well, do you have enough people? Do you have Is the vision there? Is this going to connect with enough other teams to make sure that we don't drop the ball once we ship this? I think the main difference here is that these are typically the people that produce more code than anyone else on the team. So I don't think it's necessarily a traditional management role because, at least I feel traditional managers don't end up doing that much code, which can be argued, I'm sure. This also leads to a preference towards smaller teams. We usually end up having 1 or 2 developers and 1 or 2 designers per team, and that ends up being a pretty good balance. We had one sort of a disaster project that's sort of wrapping up now, and it's sort of lasted like a year or 2. And I think the problem was we threw too many people at it. It ended up being, over the course of like a year or so, there was maybe 16 different developers on it, and it was just too much. It ended up gumming up the process, and we ended up splitting up the project into a bunch of concerns, like front-end, user interface aspects of the programming, and then the low-level refactoring of it all. And that ended up doing wonders for being able to ship it a lot faster and a lot quicker. I had a slide about limiting in-person contact because humans are all the cause of all problems in our society. So we got to figure out better ways of doing remote work. Various recorded talks and FaceTime and Beer 30 and chat rooms and stuff. The thing that's changed now is just we have a lot more resources for remote experiences. For an example, we used to do a bunch of talks internally, and Scott Chacon, one of the founders, basically created this little DINKY ARDUINO motion tracking KINECT video capture. So I'd walk around stage and the camera would follow me. This is all because Scott didn't want to control the camera in the back of the room. And now we have like a 3 or 4-person team dedicated to doing streaming video for people who aren't in the physical location of the office at this point. So for comparison, that little tiny thing, and now a whole crew of people doing this sort of stuff. The reason why I bring this up is that I think remote work requires a lot more work. And we've seen this again and again, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think most people just feel remote work can just, shove off, I'll just trust them to do stuff. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. You have to actually do more work to help remote workers feel more comfortable. So for us, that means we stream most company-wide meetings in San Francisco to the rest of the company, no matter where they are. They can watch it on demand later if it happens to happen when they're asleep. And we try to do as many things as possible to make sure that they are comfortable as much as they can and feel like they're present in the office. We found that formal events are very easy. We're very good at doing internal talks and stuff and broadcasting it to the rest of the company. But these informal conversations are hard. Getting people to relax and just kick the shit with somebody, that's the stuff that's really interesting, and I think we can do a lot better at. I think we want to experiment with more informal approaches for that. For one, robot iPads. I don't know if you've seen these. We have these little iPads at the office. They're mostly for gags, but they're kind of on these little Segway things, and you can control them and like move them around and like go up and be like, "Hi, Josh, that was a terrible intro," or something like that. Stuff like that. Or I would love to have just a window at the office between anyone who's remote to dial in, and I can like walk by of this TV and just like start talking to somebody. And you want those sort of serendipitous interactions as much as possible. And it's a lot harder to get in a chat room. You can get 90% of the way there. If I start talking about Jason Mraz and how much I love him, that was the weirdest fucking example. I liked him, and then he got really long hair, and he got really weird and poppy. I liked him before he was cool, put it that way. I don't even know what I'm talking about. Couple last things in hindsight that I think GitHub does really well that has helped us out. This quote is in one of our guidebooks that you can read. It's the documentation in GitHub/GitHub, our main repository. Build websites like it's in 2005. And I think this is the greatest thing ever. Try not to get too into, the latest and greatest, because I feel like it just doesn't matter as much. Going on from that, like our tech stack shrinks as we age. We've started ripping out more and more things because we know how to scale MySQL pretty well. We know how to scale Ruby well. If Ruby doesn't scale, write C. If C's not good enough, I don't know, have a drink or something. Beyond that, like it's the more things you add, the more complications there are, and we have a good story about how to scale certain problems that we've been facing. So we do a lot fewer trendy languages and databases, and I think that's totally fine. I think your product should be much more cutting edge, not your technology. And I think that that's where you should take your risk in terms of like crazy UI and stuff, not necessarily figuring out, well, you know, we reached this one weird edge case where MySQL may have some weird problem with it. I don't think that's really as big of a deal. Give me a couple months, we'll have emoji. Stability is sexy, and you know, it's taken a long time before we got to the point where GitHub stability is somewhere we're starting to become happy with it. And it takes a lot of money to deal with DDoS attacks. And it takes a lot of money to deal with servers. And it takes a lot of expertise to try and figure out all this sort of stuff. But I think the best way forward is to go with tried and true, because there's a lot more smarter people who have gone through this in different companies than you, who have probably spent a lot more time on this than you have as well. The other thing is resist shit just to do shit. I don't have any better way to put this than this. I think GitHub's done a really good job at remaining skeptical. Sort of every step of the way, if somebody suggests doing something new, or every step of the way, everyone's challenging, is this even the right thing we want to do at this point? The best example now is teams. Like, we got to like 75 people, and we're like, well, we need to break out into teams somehow because we're big, or you know, whatever. It took us like a year, maybe two, to really figure out how teams worked for us. And that's fine, because we tried 3 or 4 different things, and we could have just been satisfied with that and said, oh yeah, that's, you know, now we have teams, now everything's perfect, because we're doing it just like how everyone else has done it. I think it's been good for us to be like, no, we want to sit down and try and figure out what works the best for us, and reject all these other things just because some other company has done them before. So that's really cool. Finally, I mean, I think your company should change. I think you should think about this a lot, but your values shouldn't. And think about what needs to change. And I really think this is not a founder mentality or CEO mentality or even a team lead mentality. Like, I think there's a lot of things you can do even if you're on your first week on the job. Start looking around and saying, well, is this going to scale as we grow? Is this making us happy how we're doing things today? And can we start talking and making conversation about making us a better company? Because it kills me so many times to see awesome people stuck in really shitty jobs where companies just don't care about this. So start thinking about that more, and that's what I've got. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And my presenting and welcoming is awesome. We have time for 2 questions. And we've got 2. Cool.
Thanks for the talk. You spoke about buddy relationships, which is a great way of coalescing new members onto the culture or a team. I wonder, do you maintain remote buddy relationships? And if so, what techniques and things have helped?
So I think there's a couple ways to deal with remote buddy relationships. One, it's sort of mandatory that you have to be in San Francisco for your first week on the job, just to get, there's so many non-development oriented stuff that is helpful to have somebody there with you to deal with. At that point, I think what we want to do is start codifying the idea of having a stronger buddy relationship. And I think at that point, you don't have to deal with, remote is not as big of a deal. It's more just a matter of, you know, high level, how can I, you know, as a new employee, what project needs doing next, and so on. I think there's lots of different levels of what you call buddying as well. We have some people at the company who are really into pair programming, and they do that remotely all the time. Specifically 2 people, both ex-Pivotal people, which probably says a lot about them. One in Colorado, one in San Francisco, and they always just do, they're basically everyone's their buddy all the time, because they don't do anything without pairing. So I think it's just different levels of what is the most advantageous for that particular person.
Sorry. Did you find that going from being a company that, I guess, sold software to software developers to help them develop software, to a company that sold software to enterprises that do software development, changed how you did things? Like, did did your focus have to change? Did the way you present the product change, or did it have no impact at all?
It did and it didn't. I think one of the weirdest things that we did, so for those who don't know, for some context, we have GitHub.com, and then we also have GitHub Enterprise, which is our installable GitHub. You can install GitHub on your own servers, et cetera, et cetera. For the longest time, we sort of thought of them as two different products. And in the last year or so, we've been just reducing that as much as possible. And we're sort of, the .com team is sort of swallowing the enterprise team, and we're realizing that it's really should just be one product. Because there's a lot of stuff on the enterprise side of things that, they're enterprise-y features, which is a snore, but it's not, because those are the type of stuff like, team management. Like, enterprises love managing people. Wouldn't that be great to have better team management in GitHub.com? So I think that it's a weird, it's changed us, but I don't think it's necessarily, it's put us in a better direction. I think the worry is if it changes you, it means that we are no longer going to work in the same way as we have on GitHub.com. And I think the real answer is that it's opening our eyes to different use cases than we hadn't before. And I think that's the really interesting part. And we're definitely interested in that as well because we have to manage our own organization on GitHub. So there's a slew of different problems and stuff that come out of that. Some are relevant to GitHub.com, some are relevant only to enterprise. But I think the way forward is to think of them not as two different teams and trying to mesh them together and just work on the same code base, because it is the same code base. So.
Awesome. Are you sticking around for some of the day?
Yeah, I'll be here.
If you have any other questions, come harass Holman. You'll be able to find him. He'll be around with his mum. He's not allowed to leave her alone, mostly because she won't let him. You're more than welcome to pull his ear as well. Please give a big round of applause for Holman and his mum.